at that time, we're talking late 1970s, the book On the Border came out in 81 and remarkably is still in print. But the book really was a result of this trip, and I only ran into one other journalist who was traveling the border. Now you have to take a number. But back then, I ran into one fellow. He was the bureau chief of the Houston New York Times Bureau, and he was doing the same thing. In fact, he eventually won a Pulitzer Prize for his work along the border, John Crutzen. But we were really the only two people who were traveling the U.S.-Mexico border, getting a sense of its culture, getting a sense of the east-west border, the qualitative border, the border of history, of memory, the border of music and literature, the border of spirituality, the family border. It's even a border of laundry. I can remember very distinctly seeing families on both sides drying their wet clothes after washing them on the border fence. They would just hang them up on the barbed wire and the laundry would dry. That's the qualitative border. That's the third country between the U.S. and Mexico. It's 2,000 miles long and no more than 20 miles wide.
This time on the Plutopia podcast, we dig deep into the archives for a flashback to the final episode prior to our 7-year sabbatical. Travel writer Tom Miller takes us on a tour of the border. We explore both the physical and cultural border between the U.S. and Mexico. We also dig into the history of La Bamba, chimichangas, alternate facts, and JFK conspiracy theories.
I'm Scoop Sweeney, and this is Plutopia News Podcast 20 Minutes into the Future. I'm taking the lead this time, along with my partner, John Lebakowski. John, good morning.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing fine, and we have a special guest today. Normally, we have interviews with people we've barely met or barely know, and this time it's what I call a friendly fire interview. This is a person I've known for quite some time, a Tucson-based writer, Tom Miller, who few years ago, we won't try to count, he was my first stringer when I was news director at Pacifica Radio in Houston. This guy calls me up out of the blue and says, "Hey, I'm Tucson Tom, and I've got a story that you might be interested in." I can't recall what the story was, but it was really good, and it came at a really good time because I was just desperate for, any kind of good news outside of the Houston area. And over the years, kept in touch with Tom, helped him out a few times on research for his book projects. Welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad you brought up that me being a stringer for Pacifica, because I just figured it was a get-rich-quick scheme, and it was. Pacifica paid enormously well.
Oh, didn't it, though? I believe I was making $52.50 a week whenever the checks actually showed up, which was sporadically. So, yeah, we all got rich in the underground press. Right. Almost as good as the stringer fees I got from our buddy Thorne Dreyer at Space City News. Yeah,
another get-rich-quick scheme.
Yeah, in fact, in a piece you wrote for our friend Thorne's excellent rag blog, you gave a nice explanation and more or less openly embraced the job description travel writer. And what's a travel writer, and why is it a label that many of your peers seem to dislike?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot of definitions of travel writer. The one I don't like is somebody pretending to be a travel writer, and all they do is tell you where the church is, where the plaza is, and that this restaurant has an affable maitre d'. It goes far beyond that. Travel writing is really subtext. It's not text. Travel writing is when you write about something that goes on when nobody's looking. Nobody knows what's happening there. And so I try to go to places where you don't find a crowd. Let me give an example. In the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, there were hordes of reporters there who were covering the Yippies, who were covering Hubert Humphrey, who were covering Mayor Daley, who were covering the demonstrations in the streets, who were covering the convention itself. And the world did not need another reporter covering all that. It was well blanketed. So what I did was secure a little space in the back of a van, a white van that had red tape on it across. It was the Medical Committee for Human Rights, and they would travel all over the city of Chicago, picking up people who had been attacked by the Chicago police and ministering them medical aid. And you get a much better story that way when you do your observations where nobody else is looking.
So it sounds like you have a bit of a difference of opinion with the other so-called travel writers.
Yeah, and also I think travel writing is the name travel writer is a bit of a cheat, because it can be sports writing. Perhaps you can hear my dog in the background. It can be sports writing. It can be about economics. It can be about a bar band. It can be almost any topic. And travel writing is just sort of the blanket that goes over it, for lack of anything better. The downside of calling yourself a travel writer is so many people consider it nonfiction light, that it's not real, sort of like sports writing. It's not real writing, it's travel writing. And so I've never called myself a travel writer. Everybody else does, and I'm comfortable with it. I don't put it on my business card, as I've seen other people do. But travel writing essentially is going out and observing and bringing home the news.
What do you put on your business card?
Escritor, the word escritor.
Aha.
In your focus in many of your books, of course, has been the Southwest, the southwestern border.
The southwestern border and Latin America, that's right.
Yes. Yeah, everything south of Tucson, I guess.
Well, anywhere from Baja, Oklahoma, yeah.
Baja, Oklahoma,
actually,
indeed.
If it's in Arizona, it's anything south of the Gila River, really. Gila River being the east-west dividing line between... well, let's look at it this way. All the legislation that you've heard about that's embarrassing the state of Arizona so much these days comes from legislators who are north of the Gila. North of the Gila is Goldwater country, Sheriff Joe Arpaio country, John McCain country. South of the Gila is Udall country, Raul Grijalva country, Cesar Chavez country. And there's a very distinct difference in the culture between north of the Gila and south of the Gila.
It sounds a bit like the difference between Texas and Austin, never the twain shall meet.
To a certain extent, yes. To a certain extent, yes.
In the introduction to, I guess, your first border book, aptly titled On the Border, you described a fairly unusual event called a celebration nation to nation, in which officials from both sides of the border gathered for a literal cross-border volleyball game. And with
I wish that could still go on. It was wonderfully hokey. All these the sister border towns, Nuevo Laredo and Juarez and El Paso and Nogales, Arizona, Nogales, Sonora, they all have these sister city, and joint Kiwanis Club and joint Rotary Club. They all have these joint things where they shake hands and say, hands across the border, we're all buddies. And there was one in Naco, Sonora and Naco, Arizona. This is way back when. This had to have been the late 70s, and where there was just a barbed wire fence about 10 feet high dividing the U.S. and Mexico. You could see through it. You could stick your hand through it. You could take some wire clippers and cut your way through it. And the two towns of Naco would have their annual nation-to-nation celebration, and they would play volleyball, and the net was the international fence. So all the officials from the northern part of Sonora, Mexico would be on one team. All the officials from southern Arizona would be on the other team, and they would hit the ball back and forth over the international border. It was wonderful. Talk about a metaphor.
Yeah, it's ironic and actually a bit sad that you really can't do that kind of... If you tried to organize it now, there'd be Border Patrol on one side and the Federales on the other, wondering what the heck these people are doing.
And imagine, go ahead.
They'd shoot the ball out of the air.
They'd shoot the ball out of the air if it got that far, and it probably wouldn't be a ball. It would be maybe something a little more dangerous.
Indeed. The book On the Border, you made that into that was quite a project. How did you come to do that?
I traveled the entire 2,000 miles, zigzagging back and forth over a 4-month period. And I stopped in Tucson to do my laundry and to take a shower. But other than that, I was really on the road the whole time. And at that time, we're talking late 1970s, the book On the Border came out in 81 and remarkably is still in print. But the book really was a result of this trip, and I only ran into one other journalist who was traveling the border. Now you have to take a number. But back then, I ran into one fellow. He was the bureau chief of the Houston New York Times Bureau, and he was doing the same thing. In fact, he eventually won a Pulitzer Prize for his work along the border, John Crutzen. But we were really the only two people who were traveling the U.S.-Mexico border, getting a sense of its culture, getting a sense of the east-west border, the qualitative border, the border of history, of memory, the border of music and literature, the border of spirituality, the family border. It's even a border of laundry. I can remember very distinctly seeing families on both sides drying their wet clothes after washing them on the border fence. They would just hang them up on the barbed wire and the laundry would dry. That's the qualitative border. That's the third country between the U.S. and Mexico. It's 2,000 miles long and no more than 20 miles wide. The border that everybody knows about today is the quantitative border, the north-south border, the border that changes day to day, the border of statistics, the border, the number of tons of marijuana apprehended, the number of people who died in the desert, the number of people who drowned in the Rio Grande, the number of border patrolmen. All this is the statistical border that changes day to day. It's the quantitative border, and it's the north-south border, and it's the one everybody knows. I still cling to although there are fewer and fewer people who do, but I still cling to the idea of a third country between the United States and Mexico.
And that's that 20-mile strip that you explored. Have you revisited any of or met up with the people that you encountered, the places you encountered in that first trip in recent times? I mean,
I'm glad you asked.
The change must have been dramatic.
In some places, yes. Certainly Laredo. I went back a couple years ago, and it was very different. And mainly because of the sheer quantity of border patrolmen. Certainly, a lot of the Arizona towns are different. Juarez and El Paso are different. On the other hand, I had a chapter in there about the Marty Robbins bar, Rosa's Cantina. And that bar is still there, owned by the same family. It's still a working class bar for people who work in the post office, and as soon as they get off of work, they go over there. There's some things that haven't changed. And there's a fellow, in fact, who I met who's in the book who's lives in, not Bracketville, let's see, it's outside of Eagle Pass. He lives in Eagle Pass now. He used to live in Quemado, but he lives in Eagle Pass, and he's a lifelong border rat. I see somebody like him on the U.S. side. Occasionally I run into someone like him on the Mexico side, and I'm reminded of the fact that the border has an integrity that even the heavy-duty violence can't destroy.
You talk about the violence. On the border, you described an incident that really sounds like it could have come out of today's newspapers, the incident of Los Tres Mojados and the Hannigans. Talk about that and how that compares with what you're seeing today in not just Arizona. You see it in Texas. You see it in New Mexico.
Well, yes. The incident you're talking about was when 3 Mexican campesinos crossed the border just to the west of Douglas, Arizona. They crossed into a ranch owned by a fellow named George Hannigan, who was a very high-profile Republican businessman in the town of Douglas. And Hannigan and his 2 sons went out. They kidnapped these 3 campesinos, put them in the back of their pickup truck, and brought them back out to the desert, lit a little bonfire, stripped off their clothes, put their clothes in the fire, then took a poker and burned the soles of their feet, sadistically tortured them, and left them out in the desert for dead. They weren't dead. They ran naked and barefoot with the soles of their feet burned back to Mexico. I'm guessing it was about a mile and a half from where they were. And because they had such clear recollection, they were able to identify down to the clothing and the shape of the face and the body contours the 3 people who had abducted them. And so they did something no one had ever done up to that point. We're talking 1976. They filed a legal complaint against George Hannigan and his 2 sons, Pat and Tom. And this became a cause célèbre, as you might imagine, in the growing Mexican rights movement within the United States, Mexican-American rights too, but also Mexican nationals. And it attracted a lot of civil rights activists. It became as I said, very much of a cause. And in state court, in Superior Court in Cochise County, there was a jury of 12 white people, and they acquitted. George Hannigan died of a heart attack. The 2 sons went to trial. They were acquitted in state court. This is under the Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford years. And the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, much to their credit, filed a complaint against the two Hannigan brothers, and the whole thing lasted 4 or 5 years in court, and it pretty much destroyed the lives of the campesinos because they were jacked around by the Mexican government, which was not especially friendly, but was willing to cooperate. And for that matter, one of the Hannigan brothers stayed in Douglas, and for everything I know, just led a regular life. The other Hannigan brother pretty much became a bar fighter and such. He's somewhere in southern Arizona right now. The case was a very clear case of torture against Mexican campesinos, and it really stood out at the time because it was they went ahead and filed a complaint. When people talk about what's going on along the border now, I point to this thing that was 35 years ago and mention that, all this stuff didn't just start recently. This isn't, as I say, the quantitative border. People just look at it statistically and say, no, you have to go back at least this far. And it was called, this is interesting for people in Texas, it was called sadismo tejano, Texas-style sadism. Even though it was in Arizona, it was called Texas-style sadism. I kind of got a kick out of that.
I'm sure the Arizona Tourism Board did as well.
Quite possibly. Poor Arizona Tourism Board, they're so embarrassed by what's going on in the state legislature, and they're trying to attract more tourism now and conventions and businesses to settle here. And people are saying, we're not going to move there. Pretty soon there's going to be legislation that's going to compel people to carry a gun. I don't carry a gun. I don't own a gun. I've never had a reason to, never had a need to, never had a desire to. And yet I think the state legislature is going to make it illegal not to carry a gun soon. I think you're going to be pretty much, you have to wake up with a pistol next to your head.
Well, they're doing the same thing in Texas.
There is legislation to make the Colt 45, I don't know why, because it should be in Connecticut and nowhere else, because that's where it's from, but to make the Colt 45 the state gun. I always thought the squirt gun would make a good state gun, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. The Texas legislature is trying to make it legal to carry a gun on state university campuses, which I'm sure strikes fear into the hearts of many instructors. It just strikes me as being a bit strange.
It might bring Kinky Friedman out of retirement.
Yes, another gun-related story. But I'm sure people said, well, that story you just talked about was just an aberration. It doesn't happen all the time. But you detailed another rather poignant story about, I hope I pronounce it right, El Fuego Mendoza, who was
this is
shot by an overzealous border patrolman.
The border patrolman shot him and paralyzed him. He became a quadriplegic as a result of this, and this went through court for 24 months. Finally, there was a massive lawsuit, as you might imagine, and Mendoza, who was from this small town in central Mexico, was a paraplegic as a result of this border patrol shooting. And the U.S. government Justice Department finally settled on having him live in Phoenix, and they bought a house for him that had ramps and cable TV so he could pick up Mexico, and his family from Mexico was allowed to come to the States. But it completely upset the life of his family, and he was just one of thousands of people coming across the border, but he had the misfortune of being someone who was in the way of a Penny. That was the border patrolman's name who shot him. They had a way of, he got in the way of one of his bullets, and it completely destroyed the rest of his life.
So it's not just a rare occurrence, it seems. Hearing
about it is a rare occurrence, but happening is not as rare, no.
And why do you think that is? Is there only a certain type of journalist that covers those kind of things? You seem to have written about it, but what I'm hearing you say, it was missing in some of the more established journals in your area.
Well, it does take a certain amount of staying power. I mean, on the Hannigan case, I stayed with it from August of '76 when the case originated, when the incident took place, to early 1981 when the last federal court decision came down. You just have to stay on top of these things, and it may be that this new wave of journalism, this new wave of covering things will bring back the idea of sticking with a story, but it seems so many stories these days are just boom, boom, boom. That's it. Next. You just have to feed them all rather than stick with a story. And I'm old school on something like that.
Occasionally, the bad guys get the wrong end of the deal. I believe you detailed a rather interesting occurrence in your book, Revenge of the Saguaro. David Michael Grundman. Fans of the Austin Lounge Lizards will know this story, but everyone else will have to get it from my book, Revenge of the Saguaro. This has become an urban legend, but it in fact happened. One day in early 1982, a drunken fool who lived in Phoenix, that may be redundant, but a drunken fool who lived in Phoenix and a friend of his went out one day with some shotguns and a case of beer and their dog, and they went to the desert country north of Phoenix in the base of what is still called the Hieroglyphic Mountains. And they were doing target practice. They were shooting at saguaro cactus, these big, majestic, ageless, wonderful cactus that live in the desert. And of course, the saguaro everybody knows because it's sort of the symbol of the Southwest. When you see a saguaro cactus next to a store, you can be sure it's about Texas, and you can always be sure that somebody got it wrong because they don't grow in Texas. They grow only in Arizona and Sonora. That's the saguaro cactus. So, but it's the one that has the arms up along this. It's like a holdup in a bank. Somebody's got their hands up, and the saguaro is emblematic. It's iconic of the American Southwest. So these guys are using saguaro cactus as their targets. And David Michael Grundman, this drunken fool, shoots at one cactus, and boom, it falls over. He killed it. Shoots at another cactus, boom, he killed it. Moves a little to the side, kills a third, a fourth, a fifth. He's shot 5 cactus already and killed them, these big, majestic growths that are out in the desert. Then he comes to this one cactus I'll call Hashine, because Hashine in the Tohono O'odham used to be called Papago Indian language. That's the word for saguaro cactus. Saguaro is very important in the Tohono O'odham culture and language. So he gets to Hashine, 125 years old, about 5,000 pounds, and he shoots it. It doesn't fall over. He shoots again. It doesn't fall over. He moves slightly. Maybe it's the angle. It still won't fall over. Frustrated and drunk, he goes up to the cactus. He picks up a cactus rib off the ground and starts poking at the arm on the saguaro. Well, the joke was on David Michael Grundman, and so was Hashine. The arm weighed about 500 pounds. It came crashing down on David Michael Grundman and killed him. Now, the cactus itself, one of the reasons for a cactus arm, which is filled with water, and that's why it was so heavy, one of the reasons that cactus have, one of the natural reasons is to give ballast to the trunk. Well, without one arm, the entire trunk of the cactus started wobbling. It could have fallen anywhere in a 360-degree radius of David Michael Grundman, and it fell right on top of him, the coup de grace. There were pictures taken the next day of the fallen cactus. Grundman had been removed, but you could still see blood on the cactus. He did. He was over. I'm not a big believer in karma, but I must say I've never run into anybody who felt sympathy for David Michael Grundman. This was natural selection at its best. I went out there one day to look at the site, and I just kind of I tiptoed around really because I didn't want to get close enough that any of the cactus could fall on me. I represent the human race to these guys. We all look alike to them. So I went out to the site where Hashine was and where David Michael Grundman was, and I didn't really expect it to fall on me, but I just wanted to pay my respects. It just seemed like the proper thing to do. And that's the story of Hashine and David Michael Grundman.
I would think the rest of the cactus are probably less aggressive. That was probably just a particularly mean one, right?
That particular cactus was 125 years old. This was one that was he'd pretty much seen everything that there was to see out in the desert. I don't know that he had ever seen a human before, but he'll never see another human again. But neither will David Michael Grundman.
It's really interesting the border work that you've done, and your talk about that sort of arbitrary line that exists between here and Mexico and third country and so forth, which you mentioned a little bit earlier. I wonder what's changing about the border, and what's the future of the border, and to what extent is the U.S. border like other borders?
It's very unlike other borders. That I can talk. The future, I can tell you about the present. I can tell you about the past, and you can draw your own conclusions about the future. I mean, if you had interviewed somebody 6 weeks ago about Egypt or Tunisia or Libya, they would have said, I don't know, or they would have told you the future. None of them would have told you what actually has happened. So I pretty much stay away from prognostication, a word that I like, by the way. It sounds very fancy. But back to your question about the border, it is very different now it's different now from what I certainly saw when I first traveled it in the early 70s and then throughout the 70s, and actually I still go back now and then to different border towns. The difference is economic and law enforcement and drug. I mean, there's just so many things, and most of them are pretty obvious, but you still find this third country. As far as its difference from other borders, I get the feeling that there's still more spillover of culture, U.S. culture in northern Mexico and Mexican culture on the U.S. side than elsewhere. And then you'd see in other borders where you have a potential spillover, but it doesn't really exist. I think most other borders are more either corrupt, if you can imagine that, or more militarized, because you have countries that are right up next to each other that really are not the best of friends, and can't say U.S. and Mexico are the best of friends, but they're the closest of enemies.
How about the difference between the perception of the border and actually the politics of the border, sort of at the border versus farther inland where it becomes more abstract? Have you studied that very much?
I haven't studied it. I've certainly traveled within there. There's a substantial middle class in Mexico that pretty much gets ignored in most coverage, and it may be nothing to be proud of, but the Dallas Cowboys have an enormous following in central Mexico. There's all sorts of American cultural icons that are, if not accepted, at least tolerated throughout Mexico, at least in central and northern Mexico. I'm not that familiar with southern Mexico, however. As far as the Mexican culture being accepted in the interior of the United States, I believe that's very much the case. Brought in by Mexicans, brought in by individuals, by travelers, and it goes way, way back. And here's it goes back to, this was Mexico, so you can say that it was the U.S. imposed itself over this land. Here's a good example. There was a song, a very popular song, jarocho song, meaning it comes from the state of Veracruz, which was actually first heard in the late 1600s, and it traveled through Mexico for a few hundred years, and then it moved north with migration in the 1940s into the United States, into the labor camps in the western United States. The song was called La Bamba. Now, the song had come north prior to that, but it really came north with the Bracero program and with illegal immigration as well. So this song settled into the migratory labor camps in the western United States. And then in the mid-1950s, this high school dropout named Richard Valenzuela picks it up, puts on a three-chord melody, grafts a rock and roll rhythm to it, plugs in his electric guitar, and we have a new generation of La Bamba. And today, every garage band in America, the first song they learn is the three-chord La Bamba. So there's a culture, one doesn't think of that as overlapping culture, but I think from the interior of one country to the interior of another, it's not that far.
And you actually pursued that history of La Bamba in a compilation album that you put together some time back. The song goes
back to Africa, and I produced an album for Rhino Records called The Best of La Bamba. It included, by the way, the Rice University Marching Owl Band playing La Bamba. It included the Mormon Tabernacle Choir singing La Bamba. And if you ever thought you could get a celestial version of Richie Valens, there it is. We had a lot. We had, I think, in all 10 or 12 versions of La Bamba. I have a collection. I'm in your introduction, there was something you left out, and I'd like to correct that right now. I'm a bombologist. I have a doctorate in bombology. I have some 80 versions of the song here in my office. And every now and then I take them out. They aren't all originals. Some of them are on tape. People have sent me. Once it became known that I was collecting these, I got an Israeli version. I got a Peruvian version. You want to hear La Bamba in Hebrew? I can scare it up for you. It's a song that has become universal. I was in the town of Oyo, O-Y-O, in central Nigeria. This is about 8 or 9 years ago. And where was the best hotel in town? It was called La Bamba. La Bamba, which originated in Africa, I can trace it back that far, had made a complete circle and gone back to Africa. Here was a hotel called La Bamba in central Nigeria. Can you beat that?
That indicates that the Mexican culture, despite the barriers put up to it in this country and others, you can find a Mexican restaurant in just about any country on the planet. And,
I think that's so, yeah.
And that seems to be something that isn't going to go away in spite of the push by various political factions to suppress, to push back, whiten up the country, if you will. Do you see that being a continuing thing of how do you see this playing out, this battle of the cultures that's going on, especially in this country?
I don't see it really as a battle of cultures. I see an integration of cultures, really. I mean, you could spend your whole life, maybe not your whole life, but you can spend most of your life, your adult life, using Spanish only. Certainly you could spend your life using English only. But it's the mix of the two that is the fertility of the mix of the two that really gives both of them the chispa, the spark, the je ne sais quoi sont.
What I think is really interesting is, Texas Republicans are starting to have to be kind of like gay Republicans. Gay Republicans have a lot of trouble because they oppose acknowledgement of like gay marriage and that sort of thing, even though when they're in the closet they really believe in it. And Texas Republicans have to sort of take a strong stand on immigration, even though that so many of them hire people who are crossing the border, as we say, illegally. It seems to me that there's a kind of hypocrisy in political culture about immigration because it's become a politically charged topic.
Well, you're absolutely right. The hypocrisy you're talking about, the political hypocrisy, is so vast that it's almost invisible. It's an accepted hypocrisy. And every now and then there are chinks thrown into the hypocrisy, and people go, "Oh well, maybe this wasn't so. Maybe we should dilute this law a little bit, or maybe we should allow this or allow that." But in general, that hypocrisy has been accepted, and that's what's the motivating force behind a lot of this legislation that's taken over some of our state houses.
The idea of building a fence between Texas and Mexico seems so absurd to me, but there were people who were seriously about it,
You could do a trial run. You could build a fence between Texas and Oklahoma and see how that works.
Probably better. You'd probably get a lot more universal support than just being a Texan and such, and having a mother who was from Oklahoma. That was always a point of contention in the family. The politicians who seem to want to push back and will do so, but after the session is done for the day, they head down to one of the fine Mexican restaurants in Austin and have a great meal. I encountered a cross-cultural miracle in Oakland after a concert I was doing out in Oakland. I had a particular Thai restaurant that I really loved, and got to know the waiter and the cook, and we'd talk about food. And I told him about something you and I, Tom, have in common is an addiction to the chimichanga.
Oh yes,
a great miracle of the Mexican, I guess Mexican American culture. Really, it's in interior Mexico. I never really ran across a chimichanga. But
there may be by now, but it's an import if it is.
Yeah. But what happened is I described it, told him how much I liked it. Next time I came into the restaurant, the waiter says, don't order your usual. I have something special for you. And then it took them a while to put it together. He comes out with this beautiful chimichanga. I mean, beautiful.
Really?
And I'm amazed, and I bite into it, and the filling is a fiery Panang curry. And
wow.
I died and went to heaven at that moment. It was like the best chimichanga I'd ever had. And the next time I went to have one, the restaurant had disappeared. It was gone. It was now a Chinese restaurant. But for one moment in time, I was able to experience the ultimate cross-cultural dish, if you will, a Thai chimichanga.
You should mention that chimichanga is Spanish for thingamajig, right?
Yeah. I mean, you can interpret it any way you want, but that works as well as anything.
The euphemism was a well-understood Indianism for the standard Spanish chango quemado, meaning broiled monkey, which the dish resembles.
That could be. I mean, there's any number of interpretations for it. I'll buy any one of them. They're all very. Each interpretation has its own quirkiness to it and own credibility and own absurdity to it. So I'll buy all of them. I'm not, I'm not a linguist. I'm not a historian of, of food. I just like chimichangas. That's all. I must say,
interpretations can always be flexible. It's like we were talking about La Bamba, and from what I know of La Bamba, it's a different song in different places. The words are changed to fit the context, right?
Yeah. That's true. Now, there is a very high-end restaurant in Phoenix. This is when the chimichanga, the chimichanga originated in southern Arizona and then spread out from there, so that you can find them in Mexico, as you mentioned. You can find them all over now, at a Mexican restaurant in Canton, Ohio, for that matter. But there was a high-end restaurant in Phoenix where I found a lobster chimichanga with leeks, goat cheese, basil beurre blanc. I mean, they made it into this very, very almost elite kind of dish on a very expensive menu. It's like the song La Bamba, because at one point, La Bamba, which was this ditty from Veracruz, in 1946, Miguel Alemán became president of Mexico, and he was from Veracruz, so wherever he went, every time Lyndon Johnson entered a room anywhere in the world, a band would strike up Yellow Rose of Texas. He must have been really sick of that song. Well, everywhere Miguel Alemán went, a band would strike up La Bamba. And it became this high society song all of a sudden, instead of this little rustic ditty from the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And it's like the chimichanga. You can interpret it as high society. You can interpret it as salt of the earth, something in a corner dive. I'm more inclined to the dive, but I'm willing to try lobster chimichanga. Why not?
Well, all this conversation about these Mexican influences, if you will, the Mexican food, Mexican music, is vaguely reminiscent of the way that white youth became more accepting of the black culture, the African American culture back in the 50s. If you remember the appearance suddenly of what they called at the time race music. And it was suddenly embraced by all these white kids who began to understand that there was something going on that they had been unaware of.
Well,
and we're seeing a similar thing with the Mexican American culture, creeping slowly into the collective consciousness of American youth, well, not just youth, but American people, going to Mexican restaurants, listening to Hispanic music.
There was an interview, I forget which newspaper it was, an interview done just within the last week or two at a rally in Phoenix. It was a rally in support of some of the wacko legislation. And the reporter asked a teenager what she thought of this. She said she thought that Spanish should be outlawed everywhere. And then she said, well, maybe they can speak it in Mexican restaurants. I thought that was a very curious response. First of all, they speak English in Mexican restaurants, as far as I can tell. But secondly, that she had thought it through so thoroughly that she wanted the Spanish language to be outlawed in the state of Arizona, except maybe in Mexican restaurants. How about Peruvian restaurants? No, she really didn't think it through entirely.
Well, I'm trying to get my head around the idea of outlawing a language.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to apply a tongue to a law. And it's been tried and never successfully. That's why, English only. I mean, English only compared to what's being advocated now is mild. I mean, it was pretty much the beginning. If somebody's writing a history of this whole wacko movement that's been going on for 10, 12 years.
Well, this movement draws on the politics of fear, which is really an element of, I mean, borders are a part of that. When you think about the guys across the border are inherently frightening. I mean, a big part of the politics of fear is creating fear of the other, who is fear across of the other, this border or that.
Well, our sainted governor, Jan Brewer, she's the one who talked about there were beheadings out in the out in the Arizona desert, and she had to finally retract that because she couldn't find any examples of it. But something like that becomes widely accepted, and then it gets on websites, and the credibility of the web, it's close to zero. So it just gets kind of creepy.
The urban legend has become the new facts.
Yes, exactly. Well said. The urban legends have become the new facts, and then you have to disprove a negative.
And how do you do that? How can people reverse what seems to be an ongoing push toward facts being replaced by fantasy? We have dioramas on intelligent design. We have school books being edited to put in fanciful versions of American history. How do you push back on that?
Well, I agree. I'm at a loss as to how the facts of the matter can overtake the fantasy, because the accepted mythology has blanketed us all.
But
I'd like to go back, kind of take you guys back to your past, because I think you were both connected to this. Talk a little bit about conspiracy theories, because I know that you guys were involved in looking into the Kennedy assassination. And Tom, it sounds like you just sort of stumbled into that. Is that right?
You know how I stumbled into it? In the town of Athens, Texas. I was living in Tucson and sort of got run out of town by the Justice Department. I was subpoenaed to a federal grand jury that was investigating the anti-war movement. And I keep thinking if part of their motive was to get people like me to stop working in the anti-war movement, it succeeded to a certain extent. I left Tucson, and just to chill out, as the kids say these days, I moved to Austin. This was early 72, for 6 months, and ate at the Delta Diner, a place that nobody remembers. Scoop, do you remember the Delta Diner?
No, I'm afraid I missed that one.
It was a hippie feminist diner that was, I think, in the basement of a church. I'm not sure. In any event, I read in the paper that there was going to be an auction of all of the artifacts from Jack Ruby's Carousel Club. This is curious. Who would go to such a morbid event other than me? Who would go? Who wants to buy things from Jack Ruby's Carousel Club? Jack Ruby being the guy who killed Oswald, who was accused of killing Kennedy. So here we are, it's like being 3 steps removed from the Kennedy assassination. So I get in my car and I drive to Athens on the appointed day, and there are maybe 80, 90 people there, some of them very serious bidders, some of them frivolous bidders like myself, some morbidly curious, some people who are very much into it. I remember one guy bought the big sign that said Carousel Club on it. The reason all this stuff was in Athens is that after Ruby is jailed for killing Oswald, obviously the Carousel Club closes. The guy who owned the building put all of the effects of the Carousel Club in storage in essentially a warehouse in Athens. And after a few years, 8 or 9 years, he said, Jack Ruby's not coming back. I might as well just sell off all this stuff. So the guy who owned the warehouse and the guy who owned the effects put everything up for auction. My goal in going to the auction, frankly, was to buy Jack Ruby's kitchen sink. I thought, if I'm going to have a memento of the Kennedy assassination, it's going to be Jack Ruby's kitchen sink. Well, as it happens, I did not get Jack Ruby's kitchen sink. I'm embarrassed to say I went out to the Dairy Queen for a few minutes and missed it. But I came back, and there were just a few items left up for auction, and I spent $1, and I bought Jack Ruby's can opener. Now, I can hear the silence at your end. I still have it. I've put it on exhibit a few times. It still opens cans. It's a little rusty, but it's a I'm now three turns removed from the Kennedy assassination. Let's see, Kennedy to Oswald to Ruby to the can opener to me, 4 or 5 levels removed. So that's my story. Now, I just thought the notion of Jack Ruby's can opener and Jack Ruby's kitchen sink was such that I wrote it up for a magazine called Sundance. Brilliant magazine put out by the best of the underground press. It lasted all of 3 issues. And I wrote it up for Sundance and got actually a lot of feedback on it. And eventually it became the core of my first book, which was about the Kennedy assassination, called The Assassination Pleas Almanac, which was sort of a scoop. Tell me if you think this is accurate. I call it a consumer's guide to conspiracy theories. Does that sound reasonable?
That's quite accurate, actually. A good illustration is Paul Mavridi's diagram of Daley Plaza with all the projected bullet paths.
I would like to say, at the outset, it is a black humor look at the Kennedy assassination. And for the listening public, you should know that Scoop Sweeney, the host of this program you're now listening to, was one of my chief advisors and researchers and dishwashers and such matters of that nature.
And bartender as well.
Bartender, yeah, thank you very much, yes. So that became the first book. Nobody really knew what to make of it because it didn't reach a conclusion. I do interviews, at a local station in Seattle. Who killed Kennedy? I said, well, if I knew who killed Kennedy, I don't think Channel 4 in Seattle is really the appropriate venue to let the cat out of the bag. But I did present a lot of conspiracy theories. I think, Scoop, we did eliminate a number of theories, including the one the Warren Commission adopted, but I don't know that we reached a definite conclusion of who did.
We reached multiple conclusions, and basically is, I don't know.
Yes, multiple conclusions. Yes, like the multiple lone nut theory.
Yeah, what we really came down to was, my part was to research political assassinations other than the Kennedy family, and we were able to point out that it's an all-American sport, and it wasn't limited just to the politically powerful, because the real definition in Webster's was, the killing for gain of a prominent person. Well, a lot of these people were prominent perhaps in their families, but not to the Webster dictionary definition. And so we came up with 200 years worth, I believe, wasn't it?
We came up with, there was one year in there where we didn't have, we just searched everywhere. We could not come up with a lynching or a killing in one particular year.
I think we finally just punted and found a wounding.
Yeah, pending. But, and it goes up to January of this year here in Tucson, where everybody said, well, it wasn't a political shooting when Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was injured and the federal court judge and others were killed. I said, well, of course it was. This is a guy who was attending a public civic event. He took aim at a politician. Of course it's an assassination attempt. And so I don't buy this stuff that, well, this wasn't a political assassination. This was just some lone nut. Of course it was political killing.
Lone nuts, another thing that seems to be part of the American collective unconscious, I guess.
Yes.
There's one for every, whatever your belief, there's going to be a lone nut to back you up.
So why do you think there's so many conspiracy theories associated with the Kennedy assassination?
Because the facts initially did not come out. It's as simple as that. Had facts come out as they were discovered rather than swept under the rug, I think there would have been more reasonable analysis and conclusions that were more firm and more concrete than, it could have been this, it could have been that, and then 20 years later somebody dies and Penn Jones in Midlothian, Texas says, well, that's just another mysterious death. Well, people die. It's as simple as that. So, a lot of conspiracy. One of the things I discovered after, working for months and months, burrowing into all these conspiracy theories, I really don't buy most of them. I think a lot of them are just wacko, and they're just reach a conclusion and then you work backwards to support it. There's one of the major political parties uses that even today to augment its positions. But one of the things to answer your question, one of the reasons that conspiracy theories abound is that there's nothing you know, you may be able to do it now, but for many years you could not get a master's or a doctorate in assassination attempts. And there just was not real serious investigation done by the Warren Commission. Warren Commission started out with a conclusion and worked its way backwards, and they did a very good job of it. But if you look at the facts, I always got a kick out of Mark Lane, who wrote Rush to Judgment, which was really the first major work to question the Warren Commission. For the next 25, 30 years, they'd say, well, Mr. Lane, what new evidence do you have? What do you know now that you didn't know before? He said, new evidence? What's wrong with the old evidence? So this old evidence is still there, and, where are we now? Let's see, 1963 to 2011, we're pretty far down the line. So it's, somebody solved the Lincoln assassination or John Wilkes Booth, there's still some unanswered questions there, and I suspect there will always be unanswered questions about the Kennedy assassination.
Well, one of the prime conspiracy theories was Fidel did it. And that's my sly way of segueing over to Cuba. You just returned from Cuba, and did Fidel do it?
I don't recall hearing that he did. I remember that was one of the conspiracy theories, that he put some people up to it. But again, it's one of those theories that starts with a conclusion and works its way backwards, and not very well.
Exactly.
I think it was supposedly Fidel Castro, Sam Giancana, working with the CIA, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, and possibly with some very rich Texans and guys from Louisiana, plus possibly a few Russians.
How about Wonder Warthog?
He was in there too.
Yeah, I think that's a viable theory. Tom, you were one of the first, or so it's been said, that you were one of the first American journalists to travel to Cuba after the travel embargo was imposed upon Americans traveling there, and that was back in 1980.
My first trip there was 1987. There were others that went off and on prior. There was a reporter who, in the very early years of the 60s, went there, a guy from the Baltimore newspaper named William Worthy, and he had his passport lifted for going to Cuba, and Phil Oakes wrote a song about him, William Worthy isn't worthy to travel no more. Da, da, da. Anyway, it was a very good Phil Oakes song when he was writing his very topical songs. But yes, I went there in 1987, and I don't believe any foreign journalist, or certainly no American writer, had gone and lived there for a while to sort of take Cuba's temperature, to just get a good sense of day-to-day life, not Marxist health care, not sugarcane quotas, but day-to-day life, and how people play out their, the 24 hours. People who get up in the morning, go to school, go to work, sip coffee, come home, make dinner, make love, go dancing. There are certain day-to-day things that stay out of the general conversation about Cuba. When you talk about Cuba-U.S. relations, there are many elements that are left out, but it's a wonderfully erotic country. And nobody really mentions that in a loud voice. It's always, well, by the way, it's just, both the men and the women there are just stunning, and they just carry themselves so well, and they have this great posture, and they dance. I see that as a major factor in U.S.-Cuba, the dynamic between the two countries. And yet when they talk about U.S.-Cuba relations, nobody mentions what a wonderfully erotic country it is in the Caribbean.
And you just returned from a trip to Cuba last month, I believe it was. And can you contrast the changes you've seen? It's a long period of time. How much has Cuba changed? Where is that change headed? With Fidel in questionable control, some days he's there, sometimes he's not. Where are they headed?
It seems that, well, don't ask me where they're headed. Every prediction about Cuba for the last 50 years has been wrong. I'm not going to add my name to that list. But what I will tell you is that it seems that Fidel still has a hold on Cuba's foreign policy while Raul is in charge of its domestic economy. And right now they're going through a fascinating process, something they've never done before. It's an experiment. The whole Cuban government since 1959 has been an experiment. Something like this, Scoop, has never happened before. It will never happen again. there's no model on which to base it. You can't look to some historical precedent. So not only does Cuba not know where it's going, the U.S. foreign policy has been pretty much static for more than 50 years. The travel ban comes and goes, but as far as the economic embargo and trade and full diplomatic relations, nothing's changed in more than 50 years. So there's no precedent for how to deal with Cuba. Within Cuba, even though they talk about their 5-year plans and the Communist Party this and we're taking that approach in this Marxist interpretation, they've been winging it for 50 years themselves. If something works, they hold it up as an example and they tout it. If something fails, they move on to something else. They've been winging it for 50 years as well. It's just like American foreign policy. And because it had never happened before, they don't know where they're going. Because it will never happen again, there's no reason to really use it as a model for anything else. So it's all very curious. And we talked a short while ago about borders. The border between Cuba and the United States has its own permeable membrane, wouldn't you say? One of the reasons Obama did as well as he did in South Florida was there's an enormous cadre of Cuban Americans under the age of 40 who are big Obama supporters and who would like to see the travel ban lifted. They're a little unsure about the entire economic embargo, but it's one step at a time. And it's true wherever Cubans settle. One of the side effects of the Castro Revolution is that there is not a town in the United States, or for that matter in the world, where you can't find a Cuban exile. And that's because so many people have left and moved on, either legally or illegally. In this country, if they've come here illegally, they're still put on the path to citizenship. They're still granted a certain status that is very rare. But so many Cubans who came here had very progressive politics and were very uncharitable and very not forgiving about the Castro government. And it's taken a long time for others to adjust to this, that this really isn't a contradiction. It's really quite consistent.
Well, we're coming up on the end of our hour here, Tom, and I believe we could probably fill another hour just talking about Cuba and other parts of Latin America, which perhaps we can do in the near future. We're a future-focused program. What's in the future for Tom Miller? What projects can you talk about that you're interested in at this moment?
I've always had a policy of not talking about a major project until it's contracted. It sounds like a disease, but there's something I've been working on for so long. I can't back out of it, so I might as well make it public. And that is, I'm writing a book about the globalization of Don Quixote. This is a book that came out in 1605, and then part 2 in 1615, and it has taken over the world in the intervening 400 years. There are statues of Cervantes. There's statues of Quixote. There's a Quixote language school. You can't go to a small town in Spain without seeing a statue of one of them, but all over the world there's references to Don Quixote. There's films, there's opera, there's ballet. There's also a trail within Spain of the places mentioned in the book and the places in Cervantes' life. And so I'm using that trail, Don Quixote's trail, as the literary device and sort of taking off from there. And that's what I'm working on now.
Well, it sounds like we may have to talk to you about Don Quixote at some time in the future. Tom, thanks so much for spending an hour with us. And, John, anything you want to say before we leave?
I would love to have another conversation where we explore further the implications of borders.
I'm all for it.
Perhaps borders as temporary autonomous zones in the Hacking Bay way of looking at things.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're absolutely right. Borders, that's been very much my the leitmotif, to use a bad word. That's been very much what I've played with throughout, is the borders and the nuance on one side, the nuance on the other, and the disappearance of them and the imposition of them. Whether they're cultural or geographic or political or linguistic, borders are always there.
Go to TomMillerBooks.com, where you can learn more about Tom's writings, his current activities, and perhaps even watch him tilt at the occasional windmill. With John Dubkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.